Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody who is also watching us online. And we are starting. There is really, in this regard, not that much need of the introduction from our panelists because we have here all three professors of history. And among them, there is Timothy Snyder, who is a professor of history at Yale University, Yaroslav Hrytsak, who is doctor of historical sciences and professor at Ukrainian Catholic University, and Serhii Plokhii, who is the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. My name is Natalia Humaniuk. I'm Ukrainian journalist, co-founder of the Reckoning Project and the Public Interest Journalism Lab. And the theme is there, you see it. It's about the history of Ukraine, but the future of the world, I believe, with the future of Ukraine in it. But to start, I think that we are also here in a bit different capacity. We all participate in the new project, which is called Ukrainian History Global Initiative. And I think it's up to Tim Snyder to, in fact, explain what we want to achieve with that and what that would be.
Okay. Передусім хотів би сказати, як мене приємно, що я можу тут бути з своїми українськими колегами, говорити з вас про цей проєкт. This project is a wonderful thing. I'm very, very happy we can do it. The idea is to create a very broad, very deep Ukrainian history. The idea is to explore, to find the things that we don't yet know, rather than insisting on the things that we think we know. The idea is to include. We have about 100 colleagues, 100 colleagues working on this, most of them Ukrainian, many of them from abroad. The idea is to reach all the way back into history, because some of the things that we don't know but should know about the lands of Ukraine go very far back indeed. It's possible to write a great deal of the history of humanity focusing on the territories around the Black Sea, the Ukrainian steppe, the Dnipro River. So the notion is to do something also which is both very old-fashioned and extremely modern. It's very old-fashioned to think you can do a huge project about the history of a country. But this is also very contemporary in that we'll be using the latest technological models, especially to try to understand the distant past. So we'll be bringing together over the course of 3 years about 100 people to work on about 70 themes. And by the end of it, we will have rearranged the history of the world. We will have demonstrated a new model of national history. We will have created relationships among Ukrainians and between Ukrainians and others. And I think we'll have made some fantastically interesting discoveries. And at the end of it, I think we'll have a presentation of the history of Ukraine. I'm hopeful, largely because I have such great colleagues working with me on this, I'm hopeful we'll have a presentation of the history of Ukraine which will be different and better than anything that has ever been done for the history of a nation. So that's what we're aiming for. Those are our modest goals.
I would follow to Yaroslav, because if we're launching something like that, probably there is an essence. So what do you think are those missing bits of Ukrainian history which are least known and which would be something to follow and the start? What would you identify as like the pitch for this global audience of the global historians?
I would say every possible bit. Every possible bit, because for a variety of reasons, Ukrainian history was very much provincialized, isolated, not the whole world, and also the record of historians. And so they did very remarkable work throughout the 20th century, probably ironically, paradoxically, with one exception, and this is Holodomor studies. Because what has been done in Holodomor studies throughout the last 20 years, I would say, is really breakthrough. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that nowadays, I don't really remember from what time, I would say roughly 10 years, in world historiography, nobody used terms famine anymore. They use term in Holodomor, which is a strictly established term. So this is something which is really remarkable, and the lot interpretation is very good. But I would say, I would rephrase this kind of difficulty, not what kind of bits, but how we should write this history, because this is really much more important in this sense, and this I would follow what just Timothy was saying, basically, because this is a global. And why this is global? Because Ukraine is global. Yeah. Because Ukraine stands on the center of the global conflict. There's no doubt about it. That results of this conflict have a huge impact on the global history, so to say. But this is not the first time. Historians know that basically it was not the first time. There are several moments like that. There has been a book written by Dominic Levin, British historian, on the breakup of the Russian Empire in the First World War, and the first line goes like that most of all, the fate of the First World depended on what was going on in Ukraine, and in Ukraine, and on Ukraine. So this is 1914. As a few years ago, Timothy did a brilliant speech in the Bundestag, which basically says that Second World War very much was about the Ukraine. And those who now know early modern history, 17th century, Khmelnytsky uprising, it was very much global in this sense. So this is kind of the irony or paradox that Ukraine is most visible in the most critical time of the global history. We could just say Ukrainian history could be described in very short form. Now you see me, now you don't. You see this during the global crisis, and you understand this kind of thing. So this is why I believe we have to apply this principle. So just to conclude, global history without doubt, but also very importantly, so-called deep history or big history. This is something very important, because I believe for the most topics that we will focus was the prehistorical time. The written theory. Because I would probably finish with the quotation from Churchill. He was a very smart man, especially, probably know he's the one that has a Nobel Prize in history. So he said that, farther you look back, the longer you look back, the better perspective you have to look forward, so to say. You need really have a long distance distinction, which is kind of global history, but also combined with big history, or this is what is called. So actually we say they won't start with Herodotus. Probably we start with black soil, with the kind of geographical condition, all the kind of things. This is exactly this kind of story that we need to write.
It's a really great follow-up for Serhii, who is really the focus on modern history. So that would be a really interesting pass, because when I was thinking about the question, I remember how much world didn't maybe misunderstood the role of Ukraine in the fall of the Soviet Union. It's one of your books, and that would be the example from your work, how the knowledge about the Ukrainian history can change our perception of present, not for Ukrainians. So what would you think would be the task from your perspective?
Well, the task really to think about Ukraine globally, because very often when we say globally, we mean Europe. Membership in European Union is one of the major tasks. But this war also tells us about the importance of positioning Ukraine in the global context. And global context means not only North America. Ukraine, to a degree, probably is integrated into North American historiography and discourse more than any or almost any of our neighbors in Eastern Europe. For me, and certainly the task for this project, think globally when we say that we think globally. So going beyond North America, going beyond Europe. And early modern history certainly offers numerous opportunities to do that. The same certainly is true, or maybe even more true, for modern history and recent history in particular. This war is the largest war in Europe, and I would say in industrial terms, the largest war in the world since World War II, which offers not just different perspectives, but also lessons of the global importance. And circling back to the fall of the Soviet Union, this is of course an extremely important chapter in the global history of the fall of communism. This is extremely important chapter in the global history of the end of the Cold War. And it is extremely important chapter in the global history of the fall of empires. The story that, again, starts much earlier. But Ukraine is an important, if not central part, I would say important part of all these processes. not only of the fall of empires at the end of the Cold War, but also what is happening with decolonization in the Pacific, in Asia. If you think about Indonesia and what is happening there after the Japanese occupation, what is happening in Ukraine after the German occupation, if you think that India gets into the United Nations on the same ticket as Ukraine, this is an opportunity not only to integrate global history, and I mean global history, into the Ukrainian context. It's an opportunity that we can't miss, and the opportunity that didn't exist before, to really rethink and add to the global history of the 20th century, but certainly of the earlier periods as well.
Tim, this panel is named, we have the name, but whether the future of the world really depends on the history of Ukraine, isn't it an exaggeration? Can you prove that it's not?
Well, give me 3 years and 100 colleagues, and I think I can prove it.
And within 5 minutes to pitch that?
I can also do it in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I want to take the question seriously by extending a point that Professor Hrytsak just made. But before I do that, I want to stress how important it is that each of my colleagues to my left and to my right has done global history already. Slavko Hrytsak has written a global history of Ukraine, which is excellent, which I recommend. And Serhii Plokhii has written a whole series of books which show how themes which we thought were global were Ukrainian or vice versa, right? And so this move has been made by these colleagues already. Where I think the real adventure begins is in the earlier periods. Because so a lot of the things that we argue about have to do with the period between 1917 and 1991. But in the years since 1991, we have discovered a whole range of things about the very distant past, which only make Ukraine more relevant. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how Ukraine ties into world history in the very, very early periods. One is the origin of the city. So in the standard account, the city emerges in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. But thanks to contemporary technology, satellite imaging, and other things, we are now aware of large cities on the same scale as those of Egypt and Mesopotamia in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe. Cities on a different model, but nevertheless very real. And that allows for a completely different trajectory between the ancient and the modern. What happened to those cities, you might be asking? What happened to those cities was that pastoralists from the Ukrainian and the South Russian steppe who mastered the horse destroyed them, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Europe. So, and those pastoralists from Ukraine seem to have brought the Proto-Indo-European language, or versions of early Indo-European. Now, our standard account of history has to do with the written word. We can follow the Egyptians, we can follow the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Greeks, because there's a written language. But the language that I'm speaking, and for that matter, the Ukrainian language, and the languages spoken by half the people on earth, are Indo-European languages. Those languages all seem to have come from people in what is now southern Ukraine and a bit of southern Russia. That is a very significant claim about the history of the world. And it suggests that this territory is important not only for the history of the city and settlement, but also for the history of culture for the last several thousand years. Because the events that I'm talking about took place about 5,000 years ago. Third example is ancient Greece. We think about ancient Greece as being this kind of isolated temple of learning from which then we in the wise West drew in our Renaissance and so on and so forth. But the actual ancient Greece existed in a synthesis with the Scythians, which people around the Black Sea and into the steppe and into Central Asia. The ancient Athens, Pericles, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the whole kit and caboodle, were only possible because of economic relationships and cultural relationships with the Black Sea, which is reflected in Greek myth. It's reflected in Greek tragedy, but we have chosen not to see that and to take the Greeks away from their own geography. If you put the geography back in, you see a very interesting and different story. Things that we have categorized as Greek myth turn out to be the history of the Ukrainian lands. I'll give you one dramatic example and then I'll be done. The Amazons. So the Amazons figure as Greek myth. There couldn't possibly have been women warriors. The Greeks must have made that up for some cultural reason of their own. But it turns out that on grave sites in Ukraine, there is evidence of female warriors. For about 100 years, this was dismissed because the men who were digging in the holes couldn't believe that there could be women warriors. But now, thanks again to technology, we can do the ancient DNA research and we can confirm they were actually women. About 1/5 of the Scythian cavalry, it appears, were women. So the Greek myth about Achilles or Theseus or Hercules battling women on horseback turns out to be historically 100% accurate, right? And that is part of the history of the Ukrainian lands, which completely revises how we then think about Greece and everything else. You can keep doing this all the way from prehistory through early history, all the way up to the present. And so then just to emphasize Slavko's point, at every moment, not just in the modern history, at every moment when there's some kind of crucial shift, Ukraine turns out to be there, which is why I think it's plausible to talk about the future of the world.
And I'll dare to ask the follow-up, and I would apologize for it, because I want probably to, maybe it is a disclaimer, or to raise a concern how it's gonna to be run, because I went to the university and there were very great historians, but there were the ones which says like everything is coming from Ukraine, and in every culture there is a person who said like, we are a region and we have all these battles about myth and stereotypes. So how, I know your authority, but how can we explain that we won't, it won't look like that? Because I think that there is some concern.
That's an important question. Like it's really important to say, these are the history of the Ukrainian lands. And so who Ukrainians are today has to do with the city builders of 7,000 years ago, or the pastoralists of 5,000 years ago, or the Scythians of a couple or 3,000 years ago. That has to do with who Ukrainians are now, right? These are layers, they're cross-cutting layers of history. Of course, we're not saying that these are Ukrainians all the way back. What we are saying, I think, it's 3 years from now, we may have different opinions, but what we are saying is that the history of the peoples of these lands leads out to huge, not just European, but international themes. But your question hits something very important, because there's a bad way of doing national history. And the bad way of doing national history is to say, my people were here longer than your people, right? Which is a game with which all of you are familiar, right? No, Vladimir was Russian. No, Volodymyr was Ukrainian. In fact, but he was a Viking. And that's much more interesting, frankly. Like if you can connect Kiev, no, seriously, if you connect Kiev to Scandinavia, then you're connecting it to state building in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and England and France to some extent. You're connecting it to a whole wave of European state building. You're connecting yourself to the early Scandinavian sources, including the Icelandic sagas, which speak, for example, of Yaroslav, right? You're connecting yourself to something much bigger. But you're not claiming, you don't have to argue about whether he was a Ukrainian or not, which is absurd, right? It's absurd. So the bad kind is say they're all Ukrainians all the way back to Cain and Abel, they're all Ukrainians. And there's a bad way of doing global history. The bad way of doing global history is say, hey, we're all the same. We've always been all the same. That's lazy, and that's also wrong. So what we're doing is we're trying to do something which is different, where we accept the beautiful variety, and we think, this place around the Black Sea, north of the Black Sea, brings us a lot of this beautiful variety.
Yaroslav and Serhii, how would you address that? And also, what do you think Ukrainians would also, learn or should learn also from understanding that they're maybe not that unique as usually it's written in any national history book?
So, I think that in continuation what Tim just said, it's very important how it is done, and there is bad history and there is good history, and a lot in between. But it's also not just the message is important, the messenger is important as well. And this is the project that is very much, it relies on the Ukrainian expertise, and there are Ukrainian participants, but it's also an international project. With the ambition of getting into this project and making think about Ukraine, the top authorities, the top figures globally in a particular field. And that's about the messenger. And whatever the message is also depends on the messenger and authority of the messenger. And I think that this project deals with this issue of how to write global history of Ukraine so that it wouldn't be like in that joke about the globe of Ukraine. Give me the globe of Ukraine. So that's basically the structure of the project should help us to have a map and a road map, and not to create a globe of Ukraine.
What would be also a message to Ukrainians? Maybe they will also won't be sometimes satisfied
if
with
I
the
could
findings.
follow up with what just Tim says, I don't see any kind of subject of proud to being in the center of global history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I see this kind of tragedy personally for me. I would rather live in a very kind of boring country like Switzerland than be in such interesting country, unfortunately, as I say, as Ukraine for 100 or 1,000 years. One of the image which keep recurrent, at least since the 16th century, is Ukraine-Palestine of Europe. Palestine not because of many Jews, but also because it's kind of biblical land of milk and honey. And this could be kind of blessing, but it's not a blessing, it's a curse. Because invite all possible invaders for the country to take control of this country. So basically, my idea of writing let's put it this way, I'm a historian, but I don't like history. I hate history. Because history is about violence. History about the poverty. It's not Disney kind of Hollywood kind of movie. It's a very tragic movie. So what I'm trying to say that somehow Ukrainians has been caught by history. And their strategy has to overcome the history, move out of this space. But in order to have a strategy how to move out of this space, to become another boring country, a beautiful country like Switzerland or Italy, you have to understand history better. Because there is a presumption, and the presumption that I share, there is a past dependency. So to where you got through depends where you're coming from. And this must be linked somehow, must be so to so, some to be have to be stopped in this sense. So what my message would be, first of all, to Ukrainians, but also a message not to Ukrainians, but for Ukrainians. First of all, we have to realize how important Ukraine is. Period. It's not just one moment, this moment. No, it's historically so. So you have to see why we have these historical factors that put Ukraine constantly in the center of the global conflicts, so to say. This is something we have to escape, so to say. This is the first thing. Second message is that exactly we have to leave this space behind, in a sense, not remove geography, but start to do something with our presence. There is a global history is not kind of fashion. It's a new genre of historiography that emerged around the 20 or some years ago. People say that basically could write global history of anything, just of this kind of my pen is global history, so to say. The reason is why you write in this history, what specific issue are addressing, so to say. What is your message? So basically, I have this message, first of all, that we have somehow overcome this past. This kind of being at the center of the global context. It says we have to cease to be Palestine, in a sense. And secondly, we say that we have to build a big dignity of these people, because basic, some says this kind of dignity. And thirdly, and probably the most important point, that regardless of this kind of the very much problematic history, which I personally don't like, and many people don't like personally, still Ukrainians managed to persist. And this is the most important message. It's not a message for Ukrainians all the world, because basically we live in the crisis. And the major measures of the Ukrainian history, that after the crisis, you have a kind of solution. And solution comes, so to say. So basically they say this is also, to me personally, it's a history of hope. We have to write this kind of history as a kind of history of hope. Because basically, you probably know this famous quotation by my famous author, Chesterton. Because he says that, wrote once, that we telling our kids stories about dragons, not to tell them that dragons exist. We tell them that dragons could be one. And this, I believe, the most important question, because this is the story of the crises, global crisis, but also about persistence. And this is, I believe, gives a dignity to Ukrainian history, to Ukrainian people.
We need to do a lot of time travel with this panel, jumping from one period to another. Serhii, then returning to the theme of the panel, how about, I want you to tell more about the history of this war, how it define also the future, and what we can learn, especially what you are learning and researching about the Marshall Plan, about the reconstruction, something which you are really specialized.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm accustomed to the questions about the future. Sometimes I have this impression that people are interested in history only as the way to think about the future. But this is an important social function of history as a whole. This is human experience, and we all rely on our personal experience in our lives. And you can tell apart person with experience or someone who can actually use that experience from someone who has zero or really misinterprets it. And this war, again, very much is something that is very historical in its nature. First of all, the scope. It will change, it's already changed. A big part of international relations, there is a reformulation of the forces in the world in general. And I think that the way how we approach this war, also history can help. And one of the big themes that pops up again and again in discussions here at the Ukrainian House in Davos is, okay, what will happen with the American help to Ukraine? The discussion about the Marshall Plan started very early on in the first months of the war. Now there is a shift. It's not about rebuilding so much as it's about actually helping Ukraine to survive this war, emerge victorious in this war. And the questions are why the US is not acting, why it is a dysfunctional superpower, as one of the writers put in the Foreign Affairs. And looking back at, for example, Marshall Plan, it's really can be very, very instrumental. The Marshall Plan, and before that, the Truman Doctrine, was about convincing Americans that what was happening in faraway Greece, I'm sure probably half of the population couldn't find it on the map, or another half didn't care about what was happening in Turkey, explaining that to the American public in the terms that meant to them at that time, in 1947 and in 1948. And it was framed at that time in terms of anti-communism and the threat of the communism. Something that the perspective that we as historians don't agree at this point now, but that was the frame, that's how it worked. The question was that you have to go to the American citizen, you have to go to the citizen of any country and explain why it matters to her or to him. That's one of the lessons when I look at the origins of the Cold War, at the Truman Doctrine, and at the Marshall Plan. Nothing of that sort was done today in the United States, and I don't think anything was done in Europe on that scale. And another maybe important lesson, it's about the political importance of undertakings like that. Now, and I'm not an economist, but looking at what economists are writing about, there are big questions of whether Marshall Plan actually did what it claimed to do, turned around economy in Europe. By the time it took 1 year to agree on that package, by the time money started to arrive in Europe, the communists were not anymore in the government in France. The economy, with the exception of Germany, turned around and started already recovery and reached industrial production the levels before the war. But the Marshall Plan was a very important political message that allowed also European economies to borrow and provided money to do that, and that was a guarantee that there were governments and the largest economy in the world to back up that economic recovery. So politically, Marshall Plan turned out to be much, much more important than the economic assistance that was provided. And this is just one of the examples of looking at the history and being serious about the task of learning not only about the conditions of the time, which historians always have been taken seriously, but also the so-called applied history, and look at history as also as a reservoir of our experience or of the global experience. And Ukraine now is on the global arena; it has to reach to the global experience.
Timothy, you've spoken about, the importance of Ukraine and Ukrainian history to the world. But being today at where we are, I would still ask you to speak about the recent history of Ukraine, why it's really important for the future, because you were more speaking about the present.
It's one of the lessons that is on the surface is the whole story of Ukrainian denuclearization. And the story of every American diplomat who was involved in denuclearizing Ukraine, of carrying that as a badge of honor, being really very proud about what was achieved, and completely missing the point that removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine created the largest security vacuum in the center of Europe that really existed since 1991 and continued after that. So I'm not arguing that for American and maybe global interests, denuclearization was something that was positive. But what is very important to keep in mind that actually the nukes were taken away out of Ukraine, but nothing was put in place of it on the level of NATO or guarantees as opposed to assurances. And that's basically the lesson of really not just this war, but also the way how we got into this situation. Another thing is it's very difficult, first of all, to stay away and not to get into cliche. But the road to this war is very much a history of appeasement. It's a history of the 1930s actually being replayed in the 1990s and 2000s. And unfortunately, you don't see that fully until a catastrophe of that proportion, like this war, comes to the fore. And you're also very cautious in using the terms like appeasement, right? You're very cautious in using the parallels that would go to the 1930s. But with the largest war in Europe since World War II, I don't see we have any other choice but go back to that dictionary and learn from the lessons of the 30s and 40s. So this is just a couple of examples, but really with the war of that proportion, one can go on and on.
So I want to bring together a couple of things that colleagues have said in response to this general question. I think the word that Yaroslav Hrytsak used, dignity, is very important. It's very easy to go back to look at your own past and just try to pick out the good things. Oh, this shows how wonderful we were and how generous we were and how we were always on the right side. And of course, we were better than our neighbors and we were very tolerant. It's very easy to do that. And that's what school curricula generally do. I don't think that's dignified. It's even less dignified when a neighbor denies your history, tries to take it away from you, claims it for their own history. So the way to dignity is not, in my view, to just try to argue with your neighbor. The way to dignity is not to just say that you were always good. The way to dignity is to know the facts. And this is true, I think, for an individual. An individual is more dignified if he or she is capable of accepting certain things which are maybe uncomfortable or have to do with other people. You're more dignified if you understand that you're important in the story, but you're not the only person in the story, and that your story doesn't make sense without other people's stories. So this dignity, I think, is very, very important, and I think it's something which, I don't want to exaggerate this, but I think a project like this can work in that direction. Because it's not that the things that Ukrainians will discover about themselves will be expected necessarily, but the more you know about the lands where you're coming from and the peoples who came before, the more, that's one way of knowing something about yourself. And the dignity connects to subjectivity. Because Serhii, when I read these same American diplomats about 1994, it's not the only moment when I'm ashamed, but it's certainly a moment when I'm ashamed, because in between the lines of a lot of what they say and write is a kind of scorn of Ukrainians. Maybe, I feel like I can say this, it may be awkward, but like the sense that they're not real, they just complain a lot, we need to get this deal done, it's all very simple. The Ukrainian voices are not really being heard in this story. And that subjectivity is something that we can also in a way work on, that people, and of course the war has changed this, but it's just the case that people in Paris or Berlin or New York or Los Angeles are going to have an easier time taking Ukrainians seriously as a subject if Ukraine fits into the history of the world, right? And it does, is the thing. It does fit into the history of the city. It fits into the history of language, the history of medieval kingdoms, the history of religion. And when you make that case, then I think you have a kind of subjectivity that you wouldn't have otherwise. And on appeasement, it's both accidental and it's not accidental that Ukraine is at the center of this. For the reasons that Slavko Hrytsak says, it's not accidental. Ukraine is very often at the center of world conflict. But the accidental part is we didn't expect it. The rest of the world didn't expect it. In that sense, it was accidental. But so was the First World War and so was the Second World War. The First World War was about Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Second World War began with Poland, at least in Europe. The British and the French had no intention in the late 1930s of being the main allies of Poland, for crying out loud, right? That was not, but it happened the way that it happened, and then the whole world gets remade, which is where we are now. But I wanted to say that I think Ukraine is in a better position in 2024 in a certain way, because unlike Poland in 1939, Ukrainian authorities stayed in the country. Unlike Poland in 1939, Ukraine is a democracy with an active civil society. Unlike Poland in 1939, Ukraine has done a very good job militarily of defending itself, which brings you to the last point. With appeasement depended upon a psychological calculation about Hitler. If we give him certain things, he'll behave in a certain way. The appeasement, but when we realized that was wrong, we responded very quickly economically. So the Americans threw a huge amount of economic power at the situation, even before we got involved militarily. A huge amount of economic power to help Britain, also a huge amount of economic power to help the Soviet Union. In this war, we've been much slower to move from the psychological to the economic. We've stayed on the psychological. We've been, is this going to offend Putin? Is this going to hurt his feelings? How is he feeling today? It's a much more psychological century, and I think that's been a problem, because at the end of the day, wars are won not just because you have the right attitude, but because you throw economic resources and adapt your industry. And we've been strangely slow to do that.
Yaroslav, I would kindly ask you to more or less retell the whole your latest book in a couple of minutes.
Sure.
That's how the question is. But I'll formulate it differently in the theme of this panel. So, thanks to what and because of what historic background Ukraine is fighting for, that values Ukraine fights today, which are instrumental for seeing the future of the world we want to see more or less in shared way we have in this room, at least.
Thank you so much. We use the word dignity or concept of dignity several times, and I believe this concept is extremely important. And it's not for nothing that Euromaidan was called a revolution of dignity, because it's really a revolution of values. If you treat values seriously, not the kind of buzzword, but the academic term, this term emerged more or less in 60s, related with the youth revolution in France, May 68. Because basically made some kind of paradox, because this revolution for the first 100 years of history of Paris, there have been new barricades on the streets, and who were doing this revolution? Young people from Sorbonne, middle class, not a proletariat kind of thing, which is many kind of paradox. So there was something to explain this. So basically, to put the long story short, if I may so, we are now facing a new phenomenon, of which to Maidan, by exception of the second Maidan, is probably the most important point in global history. Let me give you this, that we are now facing a new phenomenon which is called revolution of values. Revolutions when people could not formulate their demands because they not could be formulated. How could you formulate dignity? How could you define dignity, so to say? This is something that could be explained, but people feel it's like a value, so to say, because they're very much metaphysical. So what I'm trying to say, the second decade of this century has been defined as decade of revolutions. We tend to forget it. The 2019, a year before the COVID, was the highest peak, the highest frequency in revolutions around the world. New Yorker, which came as a kind of the December 22, said that we never had such a high rate of revolutions everywhere. And this is the whole, how should I say, range, starting from Occupy the Wall Street, following by Arabic Spring, following, name it, Bolotnaya, Euromaidan, finishing with the protest in Belarus and Kazakhstan. This is very much global process, so to say. This is something very much. And basically, they're about values because this is basically a revolution of new middle urban class. The middle urban class that comes with the kind of great transformation from industrial to post-industrial society, because most of these people, they're related to economy services, IT, all the kind of things. So what I'm telling this here, what I'm saying here, there is one distinction between this way and the previous way, like we have a velvet revolution or colorful revolution. The thing is that this new wave was much less successful. If we have a very good record of victories in 1889, more so if during the second wave, the color revolution, we have only few revolution has won during this kind of decade, is what to say. Probably with the Arabic case, will be only exception will be Tunisia. In this kind of world, or only Ukraine. So what I'm trying to say, that if you look where this regime revolution failed, there must be a Russian track there. Syria, Sweden here, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus. So if I may use this term, I'm coming to the end, just imagine that there is a world value, it's like you have a world football championship, yeah? So you have a world value championship. When you have two finalists, one is started for revolution, which is Ukraine, and the other stands for counter-revolution, which is Russia. So what I'm saying about that important, because exactly this would be the result of this world, would depend what kind of values would be shaping the future world. Would be this traditionalist, so-called traditionalist value that allegedly Putin stays for, and most of Muslims country. Or there's been quite a new values, which called probably defined European values, post-secular, whatever thing, but we know what we mean, because this value about dignity and liberty. So I'm saying again and again, different way, that what important, even in this case, or Maidan, on this last decades, how important Ukraine is.
Please think about your questions. We'll have 15 minutes about that, but maybe very shortly, I want to cover this. Timothy, when you were explaining this project for the first time for me, you mentioned very clear, a great example, which made it very clear that, for instance, one of the best books on Vikings, kind of omitted properly Kiev Rus. I'm speaking about the book in English. And the more today Ukraine is opening to the world, when I would read the best bio on Genghis Khan, the Kiev Rus is mentioned a couple of times because the historian, the American historian, just didn't have a chance to be in Kiev and research. And the more we interact today with people from all over the world, you see that, the slogan of the Indonesian independence was Merdeka atau Mati, the freedom or death, something very relevant to Ukrainians. And we see how actually the history of a lot of tragic places is relevant. So how you gonna involve other people from outside Europe and the US, that is really global. Because we can call it global and it would be, Western. Mm-hmm. Serhii, you partially tried it, but I'm also speaking about the people who would work. And if anybody wants to add it, please. And then I'll ask the questions.
Okay. On the Vikings, so I just want to, so the colleague in question wrote a terrific history of the Vikings, in which you see the connection between the Vikings and Danish, Norwegian, mm-hmm. Swedish statehood, but it kind of peters off at Kiev, and that same colleague is now in the project reading about Kiev and Rus, and he's going to revise, right? And so there's going to be this is kind of an essential part of the whole project. We're going to get people who are major authorities on these adjacent subjects and get them into Ukrainian historiography with Ukrainian colleagues, reading recent research and moving these big things towards Ukraine. On the big themes, like the Historical Advisory Board includes people who are from well beyond Ukraine, including historians from the Global South who have, at first glance, nothing to do with Ukraine. And this is to check big themes like colonialism and anti-colonialism, where we in the Atlantic world, or even you in Ukraine, might not see a connection, but they will look into the research. This Global Advisory Board will look into the research and say, oh, by the way, didn't it occur to you that something very similar happened in Malaysia or Korea or whatever it might turn out to be? So Serhii alluded to this earlier, there's a kind of checks and balances here. Most of the researchers are Ukrainian. Most of the people who are on the Historical Advisory Board are not. And we're going to make sure that everybody is personally in connection. So that there's a method to this.
I think we can be able to address other issues during the questions. And there are some people writing me online to ask, to have the right to have a question. So Liv, you please start and then raise your hands.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. Glib Center for Economic Strategy in Kiev. Today, former Russian President Medvedev came with a telegram post claiming literally that Russia will continue killing Ukrainians until they accept that no such country as Ukraine should be here, and the only way for them to continue living and not to die is to live in Russia, because they live on historical Russian territory. From the historic perspective, what ways could you see on how to dismantle Russian imperialism that maybe is the last or one of the last imperialisms in the world? Thank you.
The last.
So, okay, I'll take that as a non-Ukrainian, and then I mean, it's very important, not as a historian, not to think that your job is to answer Medvedev's telegram posts, because you very quickly become not a historian, and then there's a way in which horrible arguments draw you in, and if you become the person who answers the horrible arguments, it's just kind of myth and anti-myth, and in a way you're kind of falling for his trap if you spend too much time with this. But, so my approach to ancient Russian land is, this is an idiotic perspective. It doesn't make any sense. Russia's not an ancient country. It's been around for a couple of centuries. The things that were happening in Rus had a lot to do with people we don't remember, like Khazars, and people we do remember, but not enough, like Vikings. And of course, the Slavs were very important. My approach is to say, don't do what the Russians are doing. Mm-hmm. Do something completely different, right? Don't destroy, create. Don't negate, affirm. Don't cut off connections, make connections. Do something which is beautiful and which involves other people and which leads to real knowledge, which is attractive all around the world. So, when we have to answer the Russian propagandists, we can answer them. But I think, I'm not really that interested in the game of directly answering Russian imperial propaganda because it's just so boring. I just can't keep myself, it's so, I realize it's historically important, but I sincerely think that the best way to deal with it is to create something next to it, which is more attractive, but more attractive because it's true. And I think Ukrainian culture is actually at the edge of doing that anyway. The parameters of the world discussion are shifting. Right? What Medvedev says would have made more sense to more people 10 years ago than it does now. The parameters are shifting, and I think the way to take advantage of that is to build something new and big and attractive. And I want the Ukrainian colleagues to answer too, but my view is that Ukrainians can get too caught up in responding to what the Russians want you to talk about. And whereas what you need to be doing is affirming the incredible variety and interesting themes that you have that are yours.
Who'll take it? Yaroslav.
I have 3 answers. First, never argue with the idiot. That's first. Secondly, coming to Russian history, we know that somehow politics always attract sociopaths and idiots. When they come to Russian history, why is it so exceptional? Why are there so many criminals and idiots in the power in Russia? Historically. And this begs for explanation. Why have Stalin, Alexander III, Nikolai II? This is the story. Why we have Putin? Why we have Russia tried several times to become a normal European country. There were several attempts. The tragedy is, the real tragedy for Russia, but more for neighbors, because we suffer this tragedy, that every time Russia tries to become a normal, it's a very short-lived, and then comes a longer period of the repression and invasion of neighbors. This is something the historian has to explain. What is wrong with Russia? This is something very important. And thirdly, this is quotation which is quite often repeated, but it's not one invented, because it's one of the Bismarck, so-called, which was fake, the quotation, because it says that Bismarck tried to explain why Germany won over the France. And the story goes that because Germany had better system of educational history. It was basically German teacher of history won over the French of history, which is a nonsense. First of all, Bismarck never said that. And this has nothing, the victory of Prussia never has this history. Just Prussia had better economy and better administration. So this is the point. You have to explain how come they are better. And could we draw some lesson from this? How can we create a better economy? How could we become more successful, so to say, administration? They wouldn't attract that many idiots like in Russia.
Okay, Victoria, who else? I see there is Mike, please.
Thanks.
Who else, please raise, so we will understand.
Victoria Wojcicka, International Center for Ukrainian Victory. I just want to continue what Gleb was asking, but just to expand the question and ask. The history of Ukraine is intertwined with the history of Russia for some time, of course, but not a long time, but still. And the future of the world actually depends on the future of Russia. So from your perspective, what's the future of Russia? What's your view on that?
I have a very short answer. Probably the Timothy and Serhii will answer. I have a friend who lives in Israel. He probably knows his name is Leonid Nevzlin. He told me the shortest Russian anecdote nowadays. You probably know that. Будущее России. Future of Russia. That's the shortest Russian anecdote. I would say that Ukraine probably doesn't have that much good scenarios. They have a choice with a better scenarios and a worse scenario. My guess is that Russia has no good scenario at all. There's a choice between worst scenario and the catastrophic scenario. So this is probably we have to discuss, but not historians, but probably something else, political studies.
Serhii.
Yeah, Russia is really ripe for a really hard landing, and it looks like the key laws that are functioning there are biological. How long the current leader of Russia would survive. I don't see anybody at all in Russia being able to continue the policies that are so harmful to Russia itself as well, no matter from what group in Kremlin or around Kremlin that person comes. That will be the moment also for the world, but also for us in Ukraine to talk to Russia and to Russians, including about their history. Because again, this project, when we talk about global history, we certainly don't exclude Russia from that global understanding of Ukrainian history. And one of the tasks, for, at least the way how I see it for this project, is it also to start with thinking of the Russian history. So I'm not sure the future of the world depends on Russia, but our future very much depends on whether we would be able in the long term to reformulate and to help the Russians to do that, to reformulate their history.
A really direct answer. So in this setting, we think about the reasons why it's important for Ukraine to win, but it's also very important for Russia to lose. And not just for the Russians, but for everybody else. I mean, they'll have no chance at normality if they win. So long as you win imperial wars, this is a lesson of European history. So long as you win imperial wars, you're not going to make it as a democracy. You're not going to make it as a rule of law state. They have to lose for themselves, and it's all that's related to the history of the world with respect to China as well. Because if Russia wins this war, I think Chinese behavior will be quite different, and I think that's incontestably about the future of the world. Whereas if Russia loses, we may buy enough time that there won't be a conflict in the Pacific, And that's a better history of the world. And I want to echo also what Serhii said. It's really important. I mean, this project is not about dismissing the history of Russia at all. It's about starting from a different place. I mean, the current scheme of Russian history, as I see it, the one that everybody in France and Germany and America and all over the world was brought up on, the one which starts with Kiev and Rus, I think that's basically untenable. I don't think that scheme of history works. But that doesn't mean that there isn't Russian history. It's just that you have to do it a different way. And I think this project will help Russian history, just like it's going to help Polish history and German history, because we're going to be starting in a different way.
The questions, or I do have some. I'll do that. As somebody who is working on the project on documenting war crimes, we're also looking at the on the historic legacy of the impunity. But I would ask how we can, define today the never again slogan after how much has been discussed about it, how much has been happening, particularly in this part of the world, and how we can place these atrocities which are happening in Ukraine, the war crimes, the attempt of genocide, the crimes against humanity in the recent history, and how we can deal, knowing that we can't say that never again really worked. It is time to rethink that actually it unfortunately remains a slogan.
It shows how important, I won't say history, but understanding the past is for how you behave in the present. Speaking as an American, a lot of our political problems right now have to do with the fact that we haven't got the difficult bits of our history right. And in general, there's a kind of, if I could say it, a kind of Russification of American memory culture, where there are more and more taboos, the textbooks are worse and worse, we're pushing off the harder parts of our conversations. Russia is an extreme example of that. Russia has domesticated its past, trained its past, turned its past into a kind of beast of burden for war. And it's not just that, it's the misunderstanding of things makes it easier to treat other people as objects. And so we can't change this miraculously, but one of the reasons why there is genocide in Ukraine is the extreme misunderstanding in Russia of who these people are and what their connections are. So history, we can't make them see it a certain way, but it does show, I think, the difference between myth and history and how we have to keep history going.
Want to?
Yeah. I agree, and what I'm going to say probably will sound a little bit self-serving. But I think that the practical reason for why, or at least one of the reasons why we have this repetition, is because there was not enough history, good history in our world, in our space, in our education. And I discovered personally with the start of this all-out war that I lived with the illusion that was maybe not verbalized, but it was with me, that somehow 1930s and World War II could not happen again. That somehow we learned the lessons and somehow we meant saying never again. And that's what I was dealing was basically almost my private matter or matter of my colleagues, that was history. And that was, I lived in a bubble. And I think that one of the ways to deal with that is actually to expand this bubble, to make history and thinking about history, historical thinking, part of the again, maybe sounds too big, but part of our everyday experience. This is happening, by the way, in Ukraine. I hear again and again that people who were not interested in history started to be interested in history because of this tragedy that is happening today. But the trick is that we need, and we don't have to be afraid or concerned that, okay, we repeat that. The idea, at least my own problem, was that I thought because I knew that everyone else knew that, and everyone else was taking that seriously. And this is not, that was not the case. So whether Bismarck said that phrase about the German or the Prussian teacher or not, certainly our teachers of history, I mean globally, failed here. Again, they're not primarily responsible for what is happening, but there is a problem with our historical thinking and historical education.
You have the question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexei Zhmyronitsky, and I'm a Ukrainian MP. And I have a question for Mr. Snyder, or maybe another speakers who agree with Mr. Snyder. As you mentioned that we need a new meta-narrative, something like communism, like a big threat for Western world to motivate the West, invest in the Ukraine, invest in the victory of Ukraine, and manage and develop the Russia with new Marshall Plan. But how can we do this in the age of postmodern? Maybe we have some collision, some conflict with the culture of postmodern, with the politics of postmodern, and this need of meta-narrative. Maybe we should invest to the new approach, something like meta-modern narrative or something like this. Because in fragmented postmodern Western world, we couldn't imagine this situation that all nations afraid of something like a big threat like communism.
And we do have kind of a minute for this answer.
I mean, if there's anything that I dislike more than the word narrative, it's the thing itself. I don't like narratives, and because narrative has a shape, and history doesn't actually have a shape. History is not predictable. History includes values. It includes unpredictable human actions. I agree with you, I think. I'm not sure, but I think I agree with you that we're not going to solve this problem with a narrative. I'm not going to say that like Ukraine has a big arc of history that like all of the colleagues are now going to fill in. That's not the point of this project at all. The point of this project is exploratory. We're going to find lots of things that we can't anticipate finding, because that's what science is like. That's what Wissenschaft is like. I'm not, in terms of like the politics of supporting Ukraine, there are good arguments which don't depend on meta-narratives. Like trying to prevent a war in China is a good argument. That Ukraine is fulfilling the entire NATO mission is a good argument. There are lots of good arguments to make which don't depend on a meta-narrative. As far as postmodernity, that can mean a lot of things, but going back to what Slavko said, history shows that values matter. Regardless of whether like you believe in them or I believe in them, historically they leave a trace. And one of the things which is certainly going on in this war between Russia and Ukraine, it's not this. I mean, the traditional values are a kind of mask. It's a war of no values against can we think of some values we still care about, right? It's something like that. And so the threat of Russia, as I see it anyway, is not an alternative set of values. It's like, hey, everybody, nothing is really true. Nothing is really valuable. Why don't you just kind of go along with that? Because that's easy. I think that's the threat. But you don't respond to it by saying, no, there's one value and it's always been true forever. I think you respond to it by saying, actually, there are a lot of truths and there are a lot of values, and I'm willing to take some risks on behalf of those values and on behalf of those truths. And a project like this isn't about like one truth or one narrative. It's about the messy history which is actually there. But at the end of the day, when we know it, we're not just smarter. I think we're more dignified. I mean, to pick up Slavko's word again, and that's what draws me to it.
Slavko, your final.
May forget about postmodernism.
Okay.
In 1994, the three very brave ladies, historiographical, wrote a book telling truth about history. And the main conclusion is postmodernism is passé. And I believe this, what we declared, was implemented on Euromaidan. Because Human says basically this is the main message, postmodernism is dead. Because basically it's not about myth or truth. The thing is what Pony says, that there could be no truth. So if there's no truth, so what is sense seeking for the truth? And this is basically ideology of Russia and Surkov. He clearly says so, that there is no truth, so actually everybody's lying. So if everybody's lying, the main strategy is not about who they're looking for truth, but who's lying more efficiently. And this is the whole point of propaganda, so to say. You have to just find a very good lie that could be sold, so to say. What we're saying, and this is something which I believe another topic for discussion, what happened in Ukraine since the Euromaidan. This is so-called epistemological truth. which is asked to explain, but the basic story is there is a historical truth. It doesn't mean that we have to know it, but we have to strive to do this. This is probably the best thing. So what I'm saying here, don't care about the postmodernism that much. It's already passé. I believe we have to just come with a very good story, which will be persuasive, which is very global, and most importantly, very well readable, so to say. And this is the most important thing.
Thank you. We are already over the time, so it's a hard stop. Thank you so much, Yaroslav Hrytsak, Timothy Snyder, and Serhii Plokhii.